Good evening. It's great to see you all here tonight, election night. I am Lawrence Douglas. I teach in the Department of Law, Jurisprudence, and Social Thought. And welcome to the third of our three CounterPoint events for this semester. This series of conversations has been made possible by a generous gift from the members of the 50th reunion class of 1970, and it's meant to support public conversations in the hopes of bridging the partisan divides in our nation and helping us to think more carefully about the most important issues facing us today. This year's theme is Democracy at the Crossroads, and it is linked to the first year seminar called Progress with a question mark, which some of you are in, and in which about 15% of Amherst first year students are currently enrolled. Our first event, as many of you know, we had a terrific discussion with Congressman Jamie Raskin, Democratic representative of Maryland. Last week, I think we had an equally lively discussion with George Packer, the award-winning journalist from the Atlantic Monthly. And tonight we are delighted and honored to host Professor Danielle Allen. Danielle Allen comes to us from Harvard University, where she's the James Bryant Conant Professor, and where she directs the Edmond Lily Safra Center for Ethics. I first got to know Danielle a number of years ago when she served as a trustee at Amherst, and I recall being really kind of dazzled by her intelligence, wisdom, insight, and perhaps most of all, her sense of clear-eyed moral purpose. As an academic, she has been brilliantly productive. She's the author of numerous books. I'll limit myself to listing those that I have personally read and deeply admired. There is our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in a defense of equality. The Life and Times of Michael A., which is a really kind of very moving personal narrative that also comments on many of the troubling aspects of our carceral world. And then most recently, Democracy in the Age of Coronavirus. And I believe you've mentioned that you are presently about to bring out another book this spring, Justice by Means of Democracy. This would already make for an incredibly impressive scholarly resume, and yet Danielle Allen is far more than just an academic. She's also committed to making a difference in the front lines of political action, a passionate believer in democratic reform. Danielle has worked to build coalitions, perhaps most notably spearheading the effort to craft the nation's roadmap to pandemic resilience, which found adoption in federal legislation and also in a presidential executive order.
We are not going to get involved in those stupid fights because they are a waste of time. We have done good work. We have found a good way of building a framework for K-12 education that is honest about the bad in the country and honest about the good in the country. And we have named the places where the teachers have challenges, like what are the hard things that teachers are trying to do, design challenges for teachers as they try to navigate this space. We are proud of our work, we believe in it, and we're going to keep.
More recently, as some of you no doubt know, she ran as governor for our great state, and while not successful this time, she made history as the first black woman to run for statewide office in Massachusetts. For her accomplishments, she has received an astonishing array of awards, everything from a MacArthur Genius Grant to the Library of Congress's Kluger Prize, which is probably the closest thing our nation has to a Nobel Prize. And we're absolutely delighted to have her on a particularly important night in our democracy. So please join me in welcoming Danielle Allen back to Amherst College.
Now y'all probably completely bored, so I do apologize for that, but it's really wonderful to be back here. And I was saying when I walked in that the most amazing thing is that this is the very first room that I ever came to an event in at Amherst College when I came for my first board meeting. and it was the event where the honorees, the honorands for commencement, are giving remarks, and the honorand in this room was Amos Hofstetter, who was rotating off the board after distinguished service, chairing and leading the board and the like. And I remember coming in and listening to Amos talk about the college and talk about what it had meant to him and everything he'd done, and just being so incredibly impressed by the students in the room and the kinds of questions people were asking, and this incredible sense of shared purpose. That's what I always sort of, ooh, there you go. That didn't happen
Chris?
last time. Yeah, that's great. I love dogs. We'll have to come say hello.
Right.
At any rate, so I'll stop reminiscing and just say it's just really wonderful to be back here with all of you. And this is just a community that I love, so I appreciate the chance to join you.
Do you want to
Yes,
start?
I will start. So hi, everyone. I'm Leah Schmalzmer. I'm a sociologist and also in the Department of American Studies, and welcome. It's so wonderful to have you here, especially on this night. And I wanted to start with a question about the elections, because it's election night. And while I don't want to press you for your predictions, I do think it's fitting to start our conversation about democracy here. And I'm just wondering if there are certain things that you're thinking about tonight, or worried about, or think we should be thinking about in the context of democracy.
Well, let's start with some of the things that are really just exciting and great to celebrate. I think there's so much sort of ambient anxiety today about the election, and so many people are feeling that. So I think let's start with some of the most exciting things. So here in Massachusetts, we are on the verge of electing a woman as governor for the first time in our state's history. So, getting pretty close to 240 years of history. It's taken an awfully long time. But we're here, and that we should just all pause and really appreciate the significance of that. It's an amazing thing. Maura Healey is terrific, super talented person, committed to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and really exciting to think that we are on the cusp of having our first woman elected as governor in the state. So I'm celebrating that and thinking a lot about that. And in a similar vein as well, I want to lift up Andrea Campbell, who is on the cusp of being elected our Attorney General, exceptionally talented. I'm sure you've heard Andrea's story, born and raised in Boston, lost both her parents at an early age to really tragic events, and bounced through different Boston public schools, ended up in Boston Latin, and made it to Princeton, and sort of real story, at this day, sometimes it feels increasingly rare story of the kind of opportunity that our schools do offer people to really achieve new levels of possibility for themselves and their families. And Andrea will be the first Black woman elected to statewide office in the history of Massachusetts. So another really huge breakthrough. And again, it's long in coming, but nonetheless important to celebrate. And in terms of the national landscape, the truth of the matter is, I know we're all on tenterhooks, but I'm honestly not sure how much there is in it, in the sense that it's been a pretty paralyzed national political landscape. It will be a pretty paralyzed national political landscape. So even if there's a sort of change in who has control of the House and or Senate, I'm not expecting to see a sort of wholesale change in our politics, more a continuation of the sort of at loggerheads partisan gridlock. So 2024 will be kind of quickly emerging into the offing as of tomorrow, basically, and so that's more likely to be where our political attention is focused, and that's going to be a challenging path from here to 2024. So.
Maybe I'll just step back from the discussion about our politics today, and maybe just ask you a question about a little bit of your own personal journey. You just mentioned Princeton. You were an undergraduate at Princeton. I'm going to go out on the limb and guess that there probably weren't that many Black women at Princeton at that time. And I just wonder if you might discuss for an audience largely made of college students what it was like being at Princeton at that time and how it's kind of shaped your career.
So it is amazing how time flies. I don't want to admit how long ago it was that I was at Princeton. So it doesn't feel like very long that I was sort of sitting where you were all sitting, but it has been, basically coming up to 30 years. And so it's amazing to me sort of what's different and what's the same in that. It's true that the student body was less diverse then than now, but it was also a campus that was pushing on diversity and trying to diversify. So I didn't actually honestly feel sort of isolated from a numbers point of view. There was sort of my room, as it happens, I was in a suite of 7, and we were majority people of color actually in our room, as it happened that first year. But what I did feel and register was a real sense of social division and fragmentation on the Princeton campus. And that was as much about being a kid from Southern California and going to the East Coast as anything else. I always joke, after Princeton, I went to England for graduate school, and the transition from Princeton to England was much easier than the transition from California to New Jersey. Like, those were worlds apart. And, because the California I grew up in was a pretty fluid, culturally fluid, multicultural place. And then you get to the East Coast, and it's sort of like, it's still like the Italians live here, and the Irish live here, and black people live here, and so forth. Like, it's like that level of kind of segmentation. That was a real shock to my system, and had trouble processing it. One of my books, Talking to Strangers, sort of in some sense in a deep way comes out of that experience, because I was like, we've got to get to a different place in terms of how we are able to interact with each other across various kinds of divides if we're going to deliver on the promises we make ourselves about democracy and opportunity. So.
I'll pick up on that.
Yeah.
So I think a lot about the place of elite colleges and universities. And you went to Princeton, you taught at University of Chicago, you're now at Harvard, we're at Amherst. And we're in this moment, and you write about this, of intense kind of polarization in terms of class inequality, divisions along race. What is the place in your mind of elite colleges and universities in this moment?
In this moment specifically, that's a great question, and I'm sure you're all thinking about that, and all thinking about your own place and role. And I guess, let me say maybe 2 different things and kind of sort of press in slightly different directions. So one is what kind of opportunity for each student is a college like this? And then second question would be, what is the sort of broader social responsibility of institutions of this kind? And I will say, for me, the experience at Princeton was life-changing in that I had the opportunity to explore in such an open-ended way that I had never imagined, and had the chance to find what I could bring and give and what my contribution was going to be. And that's an incredible gift that colleges like this can give to students, and it's not a small thing, so let me just try to make that more specific. For instance, in my sophomore year, I wandered, for reasons that I still cannot recover, into a class on ancient Athenian democracy. I literally do not know why I chose to take this class. But the teacher was great, the professor. He's a friend to this day, just one of the most dynamic, lively, energizing teachers I've ever had. But as I was taking this class, there was just something that was bugging me all the way along, reading the material. We were reading all these courtroom speeches, prosecution speeches, defense speeches, things like that. Oh, it's bugging me. I just don't get it. Something's not right here. Like halfway through the semester, I remember because like the windows were finally open. There's sort of warm breezes coming in the class. I was like, I know what's bugging me. And I put up my hand. I said, Professor, all these courtroom speeches we're reading, they never mentioned prisons. Didn't the Athenians have prisons? And my professor said, that would be a great dissertation subject. I'm like, dissertation subject? Yeah. But so the point is, that I, as a kid, grew up in Southern California in the 70s and 80s, and prisons were growing all around me. It was the single most important thing happening in Southern California in my youth. And the grown-ups, the old people, they didn't know it yet. But we kids, we noticed what was happening. And sitting there in that classroom, looking at historical material from another context, I registered the difference. That made my world contingent. Didn't have to be this way. Didn't have to have prisons everywhere. And then my teacher, incredible stroke of mentoring, right? Like didn't say, oh, that's a stupid question, or like, whatever, like the Athenian world was different. Nah, they didn't really have prisons, go think of something else to think about. Said, great question, follow that up. Maybe go to graduate school. I went to graduate school. I wrote my dissertation on punishment. I have ended up doing a lot of work on justice reform. So that's the point. It's like you don't know what the sort of small thing is in your college experience that will give you the chance to see where your perspective, where what you bring, where what you've understood and processed about our world is the thing where you can make the biggest difference. And so I do think that it matters that elite colleges still give incredibly talented, energetic, imaginative young people the chance to find that and find their path around that. Now, I give you that answer, and what I've just given you is a story about leadership, okay? An invitation to leadership. That is what elite colleges give every student who walks in their door, because not many people are getting this opportunity. So that leadership opportunity and invitation has to be taken really seriously, but it in itself is not enough. It's not enough. We can't be like W.B. Du Bois in the early 20th century to say talented 10th. Like that's all we have to care about, talented 10th. Like let's just make sure the talented 10th gets set on their path. That is not enough, because we've been watching over the last 50 years as this country has, talked about this morning, pulled apart, this great pulling apart, huge rise in income inequality, wealth inequality, total transformation of the pattern of opportunity, declines in mobility, one generation not doing better than their parents and the like. That is, I believe, why our politics are as painful and as fraught as they are, because we haven't done right by ourselves as a society. And at the core of that is the fact that education is no longer an opportunity for a whole lot of people because of what has happened with the price of college. So what does a place like this do about that? Amherst is already doing everything it can with financial aid. I believe what we have to do is that elite colleges and universities need to band together, the privates need to band together and drive public policy in support of public universities. We need to reinvest state budgets in public universities so that the price at UMass Amherst comes way down, okay? We haven't been doing that at the elites. We haven't linked arms with our friends in the publics, and it's time for us to do that. I believe that's one of the most important things that elite institutions can be doing now on behalf of our democracy.
Can I just follow up?
Sure,
'Cause
absolutely,
I have
of course.
an affirmative action question that is you're making me think about as I'm listening to this, and of course, at Amherst, we're thinking a lot about the upcoming ruling in the Supreme Court on affirmative action. And as I was preparing for your visit, I found a paper you wrote in 2014, and it was called Talent is Everywhere, right?
Yep.
And it was in an edited volume on affirmative action, thoughts on affirmative action. And in it, you argue for geography-based zip codes in particular as a metric for achieving merit-based diversity. And in your words, you say the pursuit of geographic diversity in admissions is our best hope of merging diversity and excellence at elite selective universities, my words. So I'm wondering if you can just expand on that as we're talking about kind of the role of highly selective institutions in this moment.
Sure. So yes, we have, just so many big issues on the docket right now for public life, right? They're just kind of the elections generally and what is the broad direction for the country, the kind of economic issues I was just pointing to, the Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action, which is likely to change how we have thought about achieving inclusion and diversity on college campuses going forward. So yes, these are all questions too that we've all been wrestling with for a long time. So in 2014, the essay that you're mentioning was my effort to kind of think out of the box, to say, okay, look, most things that we do in this country, we sort of iterate on every decade or so. Like, let's think about if we were going to iterate on how we achieve diversity and inclusion on college campuses. Like, what could an iteration look like that might be interesting? And the argument was, we should more or less scrap the notion that like we care about these fine gradations of test scores and things like that, and just say, okay, look, there's a threshold. We think that, roughly speaking, the threshold for successful performance at an Amherst, at a Harvard, is like X number on your SATs. And, you sort of set it about where currently the current class threshold is. Everybody is above X number. That's our threshold, okay? And then you lottery by geographic diversity at the level of zip code above that threshold. So anybody in X zip code who's, whoever's test scores plus grades and so forth, they're floating to the top of the lottery, but what you're trying to do is maximize geographic diversity by zip code. Then the other wrinkles, this is very complicated. You can see this was not really a very realistic policy proposal, but the other then element of this was that you would prioritize zip codes from which students hadn't previously come to that campus, okay? Mm-hmm. So in other words, you would be really kind of maximizing the draw from neighborhoods that have been less well represented on elite college campuses. There are sort of a lot of ideas beneath that. I mean, one is belief in the value of diversity, the value of social diversity, and its intellectual value, that people from different places and contexts bring different experiences, different perspectives, different knowledge bases, and we need that kind of collection to working together to get to the best and most powerful solutions. The other piece here is that at the end of the day, the tools that we use, ACT scores, SATs, grades, all those tools are extremely crude as measures of excellence or academic distinction. And I think we sort of fetishize them in ways that are problematic. And so I wanted to kind of try to push that out of the space to say we want to know that people are going to succeed in this academic environment. We want markers that they're going to succeed given the kind of academic demands that an institution like this puts on people, but we don't actually need to be so precise and sort of careful in these gradations because they're basically, meaningless. And so that was the goal. What that has turned into for me over time is to focus on the degree to which we can support personalization of learning for students in K through 12, as well as on college campuses, and also support approaches to assessment and evaluation that are competency-based, where students have the chance, for example, to earn badges that validate the different kinds of competencies acquired across different courses, but also in out-of-school learning contexts as well as in-school learning contexts, so that students can present a sort of portfolio of competencies mastered as their case for why they might be admitted as a part of the sort of effort of a college to build out a well-rounded, diverse, and excellent class. That was a very long-winded and technical answer. I apologize for that.
Thank you.
But that's what I've been thinking about.
So interesting.
Maybe we could focus a little about education on a lower level. One of the things you write very passionately about is the need to kind of rediscover some sense of common purpose. And it seems like one of the things you also are alert to is the way in which our schools really aren't invested in civic education, which might instill some kind of sense of common purpose. So I was wondering if you might be able to talk first about what you mean by common purpose, why that is such a critical thing for building the kind of solidarity that would keep make our society perhaps healthier, and how you imagine that being maybe done on this lower level, on the level of kind of schools.
So I talk a lot about common purpose, and I want to explain how I came to talk about that phrase and concept a little bit, because it's very abstract, and so I think I sort of want to explain why I use it, and then I can say more about the abstraction piece of it. So over the last period of years, I've been fortunate to be one of 3 co-chairs for a commission sponsored by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences on reinventing American democracy for the 21st century. And there were a lot of names for things in there that I feel like I need to explain. American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Commission, so forth. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences is this institution that was founded before the country was founded. So it was founded during the Revolution by the same people who created the Revolution, John Hancock and Ben Franklin, George Washington was one of the first members and so forth. And it was created because when they were like doing this crazy thing of telling England to, get out of the way, they knew they were doing something very strange and experimental. Got self-government, no king. What is this thing? How's it going to work? This doesn't make any sense. And so they wanted to make sure that this new country would always have the knowledge resources it needed to try to figure out like how to navigate the weird experiment of self-government for free and equal citizens in changing conditions and in conditions of pressure and emergency. So they wanted like members of the quote unquote learned professions, as they're called at the time, doctors and lawyers and educators and so forth, to be members of this thing, to be sort of on standby for the country. Like, country's got a knowledge need, American Academy standing by to like respond to the knowledge need. That was sort of the concept of this thing. And so the body has continued to exist. It has people from all kinds of professional sectors in it. Did a lot of work on nuclear issues in the middle of the 20th century, for instance, and so we have sort of were activated to do work on the question of democracy. And running a commission means, did all kinds of research, but also ran listening sessions around the country to try to ask and answer the question of, what are the barriers to healthy democracy right now? What are our people's frustrations? What can we do about it? What are the solutions? And the commission was a group of about 40 people coming from different parts of the country, different backgrounds, different political positions, and that sort of thing. And we were supposed to come up with a sort of shared picture of what was happening in the country, shared diagnosis, and we were supposed to come up with a shared set of solutions. And one of my co-chairs, a guy named Stephen Hines, kept saying, "It's about common purpose, people." And we're like, common purpose? What are you talking about? I was like, well, we're 40 people with 40 different opinions, common purpose. How are we going to come up with a common purpose? But he just kept saying that over and over again. And we started listening to him. And we started tuning in to what exactly it was he meant by common purpose. And you get it abstractly, right? Like, we have this big job. We're supposed to answer this question about democracy. We wanted one answer. We didn't want 40 answers. So at some level, common purpose means taking a diverse group and coming up with one answer about what you're going to do and being willing to invest your energies in that. But it's not as if, like, somebody waves the magic wand and voila, the common purpose, like as if there it is. No, it's much harder than that. Like, how do you actually get a thing that is experienced as common purpose? And the thing that we did was we actually came up with kind of little, very precise decision-making mechanisms to get to a place where we are all willing to sign on to the final product. So for instance, what we said was, we're not going to worry about getting unanimity for a whole package of unanimity for 31 different things, because at the end of the day, that's too much to try to ask for in diversity. But what we will try to do is make sure that we all will unanimously consent to the whole package, even if we dissent to some pieces of it. And for all 31 things that we ultimately recommended, that every single one of the 31 had to have cross-partisan support. So no single recommendation had to have unanimous support. Somebody could be against everything, but every single recommendation had to have actual bipartisan support. So that's how we structured the package. And so then we got to the end, we're like, okay, this is the moment. Like, either we're gonna unanimously consent to this thing and bury our reservations, or we're gonna walk out of here and say we couldn't do it. So we did, we took a vote, we were unanimous. 31 recommendations on how to improve democracy from a group of people that span the political spectrum. We all buried our reservations. And then we went out to sell it to people to make the case. And then this is where it got really interesting, because you go around, you're like, now you have the job of selling stuff you might not believe in. I'd never done that before. All right, that's what common purpose really means. When you are willing to go around and carry the message because you've come up with a shared answer together, and even if you don't 100% believe in all pieces of it, you're going to carry the message anyway. So I did, and then the weirdest thing started happening. I was like, I actually started agreeing. I was like making the case for these. That was pretty good. I think I just convinced myself. So the good news was that by the end of the whole thing, I actually was really on board for all parts of the package, but it was literally that psychological journey that I would want to use to capture what a kind of common purpose is about, and that willingness to do things with others because you believe the only way to get it done is together. So I'll just say last little thing here. My friend Stephen, because he kept saying, it's got to be common purpose, it's got to be common purpose. And then he kept saying, it's just like what Ben Franklin said in the last day of the Constitutional Convention, which is that Franklin stood up and said, the only way to do this is if it's unanimous. And there's definitely stuff here I don't love. It could definitely be better in my view, but I also don't think we could do any better than this. And so our job here today is to sign on unanimously and bury our reservations. And so we took that as our model. That's what common purpose is.
And might you just expand a little bit about the 31 proposals? And maybe not all 31, but maybe three that come to mind. Exactly. Yeah, three that come to mind, and maybe in the three, maybe include one that you didn't necessarily sign on to, but you then found yourself.
Oh, I can't tell you that.
Okay.
That's the
right. Oh, I see. Okay.
Exactly. I can't tell you.
Gotcha.
I can't tell you.
Okay.
I'll let you guess. You have to guess from
okay,
the
you'll do
quality
the
of my
three that.
answers.
Okay. Right. Okay.
All right. Well, first of all, I think there's a thing to say which is about the kind of core concept in the report. The report's called Our Common Purpose, actually, and you can Google it, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Our Common Purpose. And but there's a core concept before we get to the 31 recommendations. And I mentioned that when we ran this commission, we ran listening sessions all over the country, and we really wanted to talk to all kinds of different people. We talked to naval cadets, we talked to people who never vote. We talked to recent immigrants and refugees. We talked to people who came in the early 70s and 80s, and so therefore have become sort of first and second generation immigrant communities. We talked to people who are deeply civically engaged and come from long traditions of engagement. We talked to people from all racial and ethnic backgrounds, different language backgrounds, and so forth. And that was really where the meat of the work of the commission was done, was in those listening sessions around the country. And there was one session in Maine where there was a fellow there who said something in answer to a question about how he thought things were going for our democracy, about sort of roughly along the lines of, it feels like we've gotten trapped in a vicious circle. Our institutions are disappointing us. They're full of dysfunction, and we watch that, and who wants to participate in that? And so we pull back from participation, and then, we don't actually have connections in civil society that, connect us to others. So isn't democracy supposed to be a virtuous cycle? You ask that question. Isn't it supposed to be a virtuous cycle? Our institutions are supposed to function well, and that excites us to participate. And when we participate, we get connected to other people in our community, and that builds our social bonds, our sense of connection to each other. That was the grounding idea for the report, the notion that we're trapped in a vicious cycle, and our job is to figure out how to flip the switch, flip the equilibrium to a virtuous cycle. So no single reform can do the trick. We need to take our institutions from dysfunctional and non-responsive to responsive and inclusive. We need civil society organizations that support our engagement and participation, and an information ecosystem that goes with that, that makes it kind of reasonable to try to process what's happening in our political landscape. And we need a civic culture that nourishes our sense of connection to each other and a sense of a shared commitment to constitutional democracy. We've got to get all those three things happening at once. So the 31 recommendations are kind of like bucketed into those different areas. So I'll just throw out one from each bucket, and you can sort of feel free to push on whichever one you want to talk about. Increasing the size of Congress. Now, people hear that and go, what? Like, we don't like those people anyway. You want more members of Congress? More members of the House of Representatives? Yes, we should have more members of the House of Representatives. And while we're at it, we should make those districts multi-member and use ranked choice voting for it, because if we did all those things together, we'd get a bunch of stuff. You couldn't gerrymander anymore. Gerrymandering would be impossible. You would get emergent representation of minorities in any given district as well as the majoritarian group, and those minorities could be party minorities or they could be demographic minorities. So for example, in Massachusetts, we're all Democratic here in all our districts. You would end up with a district that had like 2 Democratic representatives but also a Republican that would start to show up. And ditto, conversely, in all red states, you'd have Democratic representation showing up. And what that would mean is when the 2 parties caucus in Congress, when all the Republicans go off to their caucus room and all the Democrats go off to their caucus room, you'd have the whole country in both rooms. Right now, you've got the coasts in one room and you've got the heartland in another caucus room. Okay? stop and think about what that means for processing what's happening in the country. So anyway, that change would also flow through the Electoral College and rebalance the Electoral College in various ways. That's political institutions. In the space of civil society, we think we should all be actually, investing more resources, community foundations, public sector resources, and things like that, in organizations that are self-consciously focused on cultivating bridging skills. We have super social heterogeneity. World has never yet achieved a massive scale democracy with the degree of social heterogeneity that we have. Like, we're trying, India's trying, Brazil's trying, but we're all trying to do something that's never been done in human history. So let's be intentional about it. Let's invest in organizations that are self-consciously working on helping people develop and deploy bridging skills. And then in the civic culture space, I'll just name reinvesting in civic education there on that one, where for a lot of reasons, we now spend about $54 federal dollars per year on STEM education per kid in K through 12, about 5 cents per year per kid on civic education. So, I'll say, get what you pay for. So.
Can I just ask one follow-up
Yeah,
about
of
that?
course.
So I am totally sold on increasing the size of Congress. I'm totally sold on multi-member districts and rank choice voting. Actually, I just want to make sure, is everyone familiar with what Professor Allen means by ranked choice voting? Is that something that we're all good
So
with?
when you have a ballot, you get to put your first choice person, and your second choice person, and your third choice person, and your fourth choice person. If nobody gets 50% on the first vote, you knock the bottom person off, and anybody who voted for them gets their votes reallocated to their second choice person, and you keep going until somebody's got 50% of the votes. Okay.
One of the things
Instant runoff is another way to think about it.
So I'm with all your proposals. I guess the one I have a particular concern about is how to improve our information ecosystem.
Yeah.
I mean, you might have thought, we talked about this a little bit earlier, you might have thought that, for example, the January 6th Commission was a really powerful exercise in civic education. They seem to do a very responsible job in making a powerful case about the president's concerted effort to overturn a fair and democratic election. And yet, it has been so poisoned by the disinformation that message just hasn't really had the effect that one might have predicted. How do we kind of think our way through that one?
Yeah, I think this is the hardest one, and I hope in the Q&A maybe you guys have some good ideas. I would love to hear. This is kind of all hands on deck, and so I want to hear good ideas. In the report, maybe I'll just start there, we focused on two things, really. One was on existing platform companies and how to redirect some of their behaviors in ways that would be more supportive of democracy. So for starters, that's about achieving transparency so that we have access to data that helps us understand how algorithms are being constructed, what kinds of choices are being made, so that we can then hold platform companies accountable for the consequences of their choices. So if you think about it in comparison to drug development or something like FDA, right? We know precisely what goes into any given drug. We know what kind of chemical configuration or whatever is being used and what sort of risks are thought to connect to that, and there's a kind of an evaluation process. The idea is you want to get the same sort of transparency and ability to hold accountable with regard to algorithmic choices that platform companies are using. So that's sort of part one. And then part two is that you want to also, insofar as the major platform companies, one of the negative externalities of their activity or unintended consequences, in effect, is sort of to destroy an ecosystem of local journalism that's been quite important to sustaining local political and civic engagement. So we should tax their targeted ad revenue and use that resource to fund a revitalization of an ecosystem of local journalism and connect that to a kind of rebuilding of public understanding about standards for journalism and use of evidence and things like that. So we have some sort of chance of trying to like strengthen people's ability to, appreciate and desire a kind of healthy universe of information.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, again, technical answers, complicated. I do think this is basically the hardest question that we have.
Mm.
Can I go back to, I find this all really compelling, and I'm thinking about trust and common purpose and the social contract. And I guess I'm wondering, as a sociologist, when you think about the context, I'm thinking especially of class inequality in the United States, can you build trust in that context, or do you have to address the inequality first, or can you address the trust and then that helps with inequality? Like, what comes first, or what are the challenges of doing what you're talking about doing in a context of growing kind of structural inequalities?
I appreciate your question. I mean, I think it does a good job of capturing what a lot of us feel, which is overwhelmed, right? That, you sort of look around us and the problems feel very big. And you also feel like, is it enough to tug over here, or don't I have to tug over here as well? And so I do think it's sort of both and, that we have to be able to work on both things at once, on trust, which for me means always working on trustworthiness. Like, the way you get trust is like by being trustworthy. So for all the things we don't trust, whether that's government, whatever else, et cetera, down the list, then what do you need to do to be trustworthy? Let's ask that question. And then start to figure that out. So we do need to do that, but you're quite right that in context of significant inequality, and then the way that sort of flows through to other decision-making mechanisms, that undermines the emergence of conversational spaces where people's perspectives are kind of fairly represented in relationship to each other. So this is getting a little abstract. What I'm trying to communicate is in a kind of media environment where some voices have more power than others because of how money is operating, you're not going to actually get sort of a full and fair representation of all perspectives. People then don't see themselves, in the media environment, and that automatically starts to generate distrust. So the inequality is a sort of source of the distrust, but we have to sort of work on both things simultaneously. It's not as if we could just, wait until we've fully managed to tackle the problems of inequality to start to try to rebuild conversational contexts where people can communicate fully to each other. So we kind of have to try to work on both things at the same time. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
I actually want to open it up, but maybe I'll just ask one question about you, something about your disposition. And I think a lot of people who are here tonight were probably also present for George Packard's conversation, which I would have to say was a bit of a bummer. I mean, I think it was I think he was quite pessimistic. And Jamie Raskin was here earlier, and like you, he started out with a distinguished academic career and then moved, like you, into politics. And he also seemed to project a kind of optimism. And I was just wondering, you also project an optimism that I wish I could share. And I wonder is it dispositional? Is it something from your background? Is it something which I have to assume this kind of persona in order to fight for the things I'm fighting about? Just wondering if you could talk about that specifically for young people who might be deeply troubled about the direction this country is moving in.
Thank you, Lawrence. I appreciate that. And I will answer your question. I'm going to backtrack for 1 second, though, to say one more thing about the misinformation piece, if you don't mind. Because I sort of turned it over to you guys and said, I really want to know what you're thinking about that, what your answers are. And I'm not kidding, like I really do want to know. So I hope we can talk about that. So I want to just sort of share one thing to provide a context for that question as well. So we have been wrestling with the misinformation and disinformation problem for a while already. And for me personally, it was a sort of issue I became deeply attuned to in 2007. So you guys, it was a crazy thing to say, but I guess you guys probably barely remember 2007. But anyway, for those of us who do, Michael, and a few others in the room, Lawrence, that was the year that a certain somebody named Barack Obama was running for the presidency. And something happened when Barack Obama was running for the presidency, which is that there were these rumors circulating, Barack Obama is a Muslim. They were circulating by email. And I was working in the Obama campaign. I was very concerned about these rumors. The press, the mainstream press, was ignoring them because the standard journalistic frame at the time was, we don't recirculate junk and disinformation. We'll just ignore it. It'll go away. But I was watching, whoa, it's moving poll numbers. It's moving poll numbers. It's not going away. This is not a thing that can be ignored. We have to understand it. So I did a lot of work to try to figure out the sources of it, found the sources and so forth. Did various things to kind of get it exposed, get it attention, and that kind of thing. And that was sort of the beginning in my professional life of the kind of thinking about disinformation and misinformation and what to do about it. And one of the things that came out of that pretty quickly, within a couple of years, was the invention by the St. Petersburg Times, newspaper based in Florida, of something called PolitiFact. I don't know if any of you have even heard of PolitiFact anymore. Does anybody still use PolitiFact? Exactly. That's what I thought. Well, you do. Well, I wasn't asking you. That's
and
exactly
I remember
my
2007.
Point. Exactly. Yeah. That's right. Exactly. Bingo. That's the point. So what PolitiFact was a website that more or less collected disinformation and fact-checked it, evaluated it, and sort of said, like, untrue, 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 partially true, and so forth. And in 2009, that felt like an answer. That felt like a solution to the problem. It felt like so much of a solution that, serving on the Pulitzer Prize Board at the time, we gave them a Pulitzer Prize for it. And now you guys don't even know about PolitiFact because it's been swamped, completely swamped by the magnitude of misinformation and disinformation. So the point is just to say that back then we thought we knew some answers and we did some things that we thought would help, and it didn't work, which means we're all back here trying to figure this one out again, and it's really hard, and people have been stuck on it for a long time, which is why we really need more brains working on it. So this actually brings me to my answer to your question, which is, you'll have noticed, and some of you that I talked with this morning will have noticed, I'm a how question. How do we solve our problem? Or a how person, rather, a how question asker. Not a, are we going to solve our problem? I'm just a how, okay? It's not a question, but do we have a choice, people? Like, do we, do you not want to solve this? Like, do you want to live this way?
No.
So it's just how. And the incredible thing about human beings is we are problem solvers. And if we really do put our heads together, it's incredible what we can come up with. I mean, it's also incredible the bad stuff we human beings can come up with. So that is the negative of it. But nonetheless, I do believe failure is not an option. So that's why I always kind of come back to. And I always come back to my great-granddad, my great-grandmother, my granddad in northern Florida, who helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in the era of Jim Crow, with like massive numbers of lynchings happening all around him. And my great-grandmother, who fought for women's right to vote at a point when, the view of many was, well, why does a woman need to vote? She's just going to vote the way her husband votes. I don't know, it just doubles the number of votes, doesn't change anything, right? That's what they said. Like, it's not an option to live this way. So it's not a question of whether we're going to change it, it's just a question of how. So that's sort of where my disposition comes from, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to open it up to questions from y'all. So feel free to, do you want me to call or do you want to call?
If you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead. And there's a mic, I think, that is moving. Yeah, I think, in fact, I can.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. So I was just thinking about your discussion that you just had about like fake news and misinformation. And I know that a big thing that George Packer was talking about last week was kind of the unique role of social media and how it's kind of eroded and negatively impacted the way that democracy acts today and kind of like the freedom of political opinion. And I was just curious what your thoughts are on like the unique role social media has played in our modern landscape of democracy, and what you think as young people who have kind of like brought forth this social media generation, what you think our responsibility is in making sure that social media doesn't just send us into more of an apocalyptic spiral.
Well, first of all, don't blame yourselves for it, because you're definitely not the people who brought it forward. So, you are not on the hook for that, for sure. That belongs to the generation above you. We'll blame Mark Zuckerberg. It's like his cohort. We'll blame. Yes, George is right, and I want to, I guess, maybe say two things that I think merit your attention. The first relates to constitutional design, and maybe George talked about this. He may have done, but it's sort of an interesting fact and hard challenge for all of us that the invention of social media actually knocked one of the pillars out from underneath the design of our Constitution. So let me explain what I mean by that. So, they had problems of factionalism and tribalism too in the 1780s. We won't go into all of it, but the whole purpose of the Constitutional Convention was really to try to reorganize governance to solve the problem of faction. And if you read the Federalist Papers, which are those essays that Madison, Hamilton, Jay wrote to argue for the new Constitution, in Federalist 10th essay, Madison sort of outlines how the Constitution was designed to solve the problem of faction. We teach this essay pretty frequently. You may encounter it at some point. But we tend to teach just half of the argument. We tend to teach the half of the argument that says the solution to faction is representative democracy instead of direct democracy. We won't have everybody gathered, on the Mall in Washington just voting all the time, because that'd be crazy and you can never control anything. We'll elect representatives. They will synthesize and filter opinion and give us a kind of, more rational set of choices or whatever decisions. But that was only half of the argument. What Madison actually argued was that it's representation in a broad republic that will make the difference, and that was his language, a broad republic. He was referring specifically to geography and geographic dispersal. And the argument was the very fact of breadth, of the rivers and the mountains breaking people up, would be that it would make it hard for people with extreme views to find each other. They would have to go through representatives to get their views into the public sphere. Geographic dispersal was an actual premise of the design of the Constitution. All right? It was supposed to be part of what made representation work. So that's why I say we've got a really big job. We've got a really big job, because we had to figure out how to redesign representation so that it can work in conditions where there is no geographic dispersal. All right, so that's really the big challenge that social media has put on the table for us. That is why I'm a supporter of ranked choice voting, for example, because I think by virtue of requiring somebody to get over that 50% threshold, it forces more filtering of opinions and more work towards synthesis. It sort of replaces what geographic dispersal was supposed to do. But that's the kind of designed thinking we have to bring to bear in this moment. So that's thing one to think about when you're thinking about social media. So here's thing two, and it's not any easier. That's why we need you guys. So thing two is, it's not just social media. It's not just that there's this sort of new element in the environment. We've got oxygen and carbon, and now we've got social media too, and we just all have to kind of process it. Sometimes it feels like that's how we talk about it or think about it. But so I write a column for the Washington Post, done that for kind of a long time, and I wrote a load of columns 2015 and 2016 against the election of Donald Trump. I wrote one of the first columns to say, you guys are all laughing at this guy, but we kind of got to take him seriously because there's something happening over here. I was and it's bad. That was my basic take. Anyway, just me? Okay. But anyway, I wrote consistently in that vein, and as a result, I got just huge amounts of death threats and just nasty stuff. Pictures of nooses via tweets and pictures of gas chambers and comments. All that dreck, okay? And it was affecting me. It was having a psychological impact. I was like, I don't want to go out. It's like, it was anonymous. Who are these people sending me this? Is it that guy? Is it that person? Who's sending me this stuff? So, because I don't like being trapped in feelings like that, I asked a friend to help me do an analysis of where this stuff was coming from toward me. Somebody was sort of expert in social media stuff, social media tools. So he did, and lo and behold, most of it was coming from Europe. I was like, oh, I can love my fellow Americans again. They don't hate me. It's just some crazy white supremacist nuts in Europe. Okay? Which it truly was. And the reason I'm telling that story is because it is literally the case that there are global networks of white supremacy advocates and Russia, for real, that are proactively using social media to stir up division and polarization in this country, okay? So social media isn't just a natural organic thing that's having effect. It is literally a tool being used by people who want to make us a weaker society. And so then the question is why are we vulnerable to it? That's what we have to fix. Because we can't stop people trying to undermine us, because they're gonna do that. Because I am a realpolitik person in terms of international relations. That's going to happen. So we need to not be vulnerable to manipulation in that way. And just to give you a sense of how precise it is, okay? In 2016, in Texas, and I think it was Austin, I can't remember, I'm pretty sure it was the Capitol. I'm pretty sure it was near the Capitol building, so Austin. There were 2 protests at the same time. One anti-Islamic protest, anti-Islamic immigrants protest, and then a counter-protest, pro support for Islamic refugees and immigrants. Both protests were brought about by Russian Facebook groups. Intentionally. They intentionally brought about both things to cause the conflict, literally physical conflict on the streets of Austin, Texas. Okay? And this is documented in the federal documents that reviewed the Russian interference in the 2016 election. So it's literally at that level that we have to understand the social media challenge. Again, it's not about the tools or organic elements. It is literally about how people are using them to cause the problems that we are experiencing.
Questions? Yeah. Oh, yeah, Jane.
Back again.
Yeah, that's good.
Hi. I guess sort of thinking about the things you said about your time at Princeton and about leadership and about having more minds to think about these issues. I wondered if you I noticed that Amherst, and I don't know if this is unique to, it's unique to elite colleges where a lot of students I feel end up going into say business and finance and less so public service, and I don't know if you've noticed that this was always the case or if this is a new phenomenon, and what you make of this and how do we fix it if it's a problem?
Well, it's a good question in terms of whether it's changed over time. That's a little hard to answer. I don't know the answer to that one. That would be interesting to know. Somebody knows the answer. Those are probably statistics we could clarify. I would be curious to know. In terms of fixing it, honestly, I think there's one thing that our colleges and universities should be doing that would make a big difference. So I'm sure you've all noticed the consulting firms, they all show up right in September to interview people for summer things. Yeah. Okay, there's the answer. All the rest of us need to be there that same week. Fair enough. People need jobs. Those are the people who show up first offering jobs and opportunities. So it makes sense that choices get skewed in that direction. Those of us who focus on public service roles, nonprofit orgs, we don't have the same infrastructure for recruitment. And that puts us at a perpetual disadvantage. And I do actually think this is a thing colleges and universities could very usefully remedy pretty easily. Just making sure that recruitment week, that there's as much infrastructure for those other opportunities as those businesses are bringing to bear for themselves.
Questions? Yeah. Maybe we can, I don't know if, is there anyone to circulate the, go ahead. Yeah, maybe it'd be good to also just get online or something like that. If you have a question, maybe you can
wanna go
already move.
Okay. All right, so yeah, hi, Professor Allen. It's really cool to see you because I took this philosophy class last spring where we actually capped it off. It was called Education for Democracy. We capped it off by reading your article in The Atlantic, The Road from Serfdom. And it's interesting because in that article, you seem to sort of invoke the founders a lot. And even just now, you know, you talked about like Ben Franklin saying, you know, yeah, like barrier reservations. But you also acknowledge that in recent years, a lot of people have just dismissed what the founders have said, like, you know, they owned slaves, they were just like a bunch of white men, XYZ reasons. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on the value you see in sort of appealing to the founders in this current, you know, crisis of democracy.
Thank you. This is always it's a problem. You invite a professor to come talk, and we have a bad habit of going on at length. And that was just like an invitation to give you like my longest lecture. I'm going to restrain myself. But I love the question. Thank you. So, people who know me know I have a terrible habit of quoting the Declaration of Independence to answer, roughly speaking, that question. So, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its powers in such form as to them, as to you, shall seem most likely to affect your safety and happiness. It's one sentence. We forget that. And we tend to stop after those examples of rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They're just examples, right? Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's an invitation to inquiry right there. Like, what else goes on that list? Health? Maybe, I don't know. So it's an incredibly efficient way of communicating what the purpose and structure of self-government is and its value. It's also the sentence that contains the deep mistake that was made at the founding. So, you know, you know, I mean, everybody knows, like, I'm always annoyed because, like, everybody gives Thomas Jefferson credit for the Declaration of Independence, right? Yeah, who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Thomas Jefferson. Why do we say that? Because he put it on his tombstone. He put author Declaration of Independence. And it's true. It's true. So that's the biggest lesson from Thomas Jefferson. If you want credit for something, put it on your tombstone. Okay? He chaired a committee. There were 5 people on it. John Adams was just as important to that text as Thomas Jefferson. John Adams sketched the intellectual architecture of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams never owned slaves. Slavery was over in Massachusetts before the end of the Revolutionary War, thanks to the work of John Adams and others, drawing on exactly that sentence I just quoted. The country has an abolition tradition that goes back to the very beginning, and we don't tell that story enough. We do also have an enslavement tradition that goes back to the beginning. That is true. We have both traditions, and they've been in a constant fight. But the abolition tradition goes back to the beginning, and it's important for us to remember that. But that mistake I mentioned, lots of people wrote to John Adams in the spring of 1776 to raise questions, objections. Abigail Adams, for example, wrote to him and said, A, why are you guys taking so long? Like, you guys are being really slow about this revolution thing. It's like a good idea. Why are you so slow? That was one of her criticisms. And then she also said, and by the way, I am concerned, though, about ladies. Like, where are the ladies in this? All right? You husbands have a habit of tyranny and abusing power. Her vocabulary, those were her words. So where are the ladies? And other people said, well, what's going to be the role for working people? What's going to be the role for free blacks? So people were asking these questions at the time. These were not questions that came later. They were asking these questions at the time. And to all of them, John wrote back in roughly the same way. He more or less invoked the conceptual structure of that sentence from the Declaration I cited. The end of it was, right, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish and lay a foundation on principle and organize the powers of government as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So it's like lay a foundation on principle and figure out how to organize the powers to operationalize this goal of safety and happiness. Okay, like that's the job. Like that's what it means to be a citizen. Lay the foundation on principle, figure out how to organize the powers of government. So he would write back to them and say, yeah, like this principle stuff, these rights, they're for everybody, and we mean it. We're serious about it. Like, yes, Abigail, it's for you too. And yes, Mr. Warren, it's for working people. But this question of how we're going to organize the powers of government, well, for that, he wrote to Abigail, we're going to use our, quote, masculine system. And to Mr. Warren, he wrote, for that, we're going to put power in the hands of people with property. So it was that distinction between the principles and organizing the powers. And Abigail wrote back, and she's like, I'm not so sure. And she made the point that, when you put power in the hands of people, absolute power, people abuse power. She articulated the view that, okay, well, maybe we'll give you one more chance, but it may be that we women, in her words, will have to foment rebellion for voice and representation. And that is, of course, what happened. But what she was really doing was making a really important philosophical point, which is that you cannot actually achieve securing those rights for everybody unless you have organized power so that everybody shares in power. So the founding generation is useful because they got some stuff really right, and they're also useful because they got some stuff really wrong. And figuring out how they could do both of those things and where they got stuff wrong is extremely intellectually enriching and clarifies the work we have for ourselves now in the 21st century. And we shouldn't rob ourselves of that resource for thought, because some people, like Thomas Jefferson, were like, horrible. That's my answer. That was my short version.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is on. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I was just hoping to kind of hear some more of your thoughts on the relationship between the U.S., the international system, and democracy, because I don't think democracy is any longer an domestic issue. It's international, and the U.S. has a track record of committing less than savory acts in the name of democracy.
Yeah.
A thing they do up until today. So something I kind of struggle with is how can the U.S. be this beacon of democracy when they go out and purport to spread democracy when furthering business or kind of other political interests that really have nothing objectively to do with democracy or fair representation?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question, and it's, so thank you. I mean, I think that's one of the hardest questions that any of us can have in terms of thinking about our relationship to our country and its way of being in the world. So it's a hard question for me too, so I appreciate very much your posing it. I mean, the short of it is, I have the luxury, on the one hand, of being able to answer as a philosopher, and then the responsibility, as have all of you, to also give an answer as a citizen. The philosopher's answer is sort of easy, unfortunately, right? Like the philosopher's answer is, at the end of the day, democracy is not a thing that you can impose on others. Democracy is a thing people need to make for themselves. So here I follow a philosopher named Michael Walzer in the view that any of us is sort of acting within reason if we provide sort of aid and comfort to anybody in another place who's working to build democracy in their own context. But that interventions, et cetera, armed interventions are not justified. So individuals can provide aid and comfort of nonviolent kind in support of other people pursuing democracy, but no, state interventions are not justified. So that, sort of philosophically speaking, is where I sit, where I reside. And your point is that there's a real kind of gap between that philosophical ideal and the reality that we see around us. And I don't think I have a very good answer for you on the second one, other than to say that that is really why political leadership matters so much. And at the end of the day, when you sort of think about the kind of structure and operations of constitutional democracy, the executive, the president, that is really the place where the responsibility for figuring out those international relations and entanglements resides. We don't really give a lot of attention to that in our politics right now. But we should. And we have gotten to a place in our national politics where we just have very little awareness of what the country's actually doing. I mean, like the magnitude of drone attacks, for example, around the globe, the magnitude of unauthorized military actions and interventions is quite staggering. It's been really massively spiked up in the second half of the 20th century. So I don't have a good answer for you, but I want to affirm that you have definitely articulated an important problem, that it would be good, bring it to the surface. It would be a great dissertation topic. So keep it up.
Thank you.
Oh, hello, Professor. Thank you very much for your illuminating talk. I went to both sessions, and they were really, really helpful. I would just like to ask some questions about the common purpose which you spoke of. It seems like you believe that the common purpose is a way to sort of bind together the divided state, through which to create kind of a package which gets bipartisan support. But it kind of worries me a little bit that it appears that seems what is underneath this concept of the common purpose is first a notion of a kind of common world, which is an ideal that is shared by all. And two, as you have mentioned, the courage and will to make compromises and sacrifices and be willing to sympathize. Now, I think many of us in this room who really feels a responsibility for the world and who are really willing to make changes are going to say that, yes, we agree to the common purpose because we are willing to make this sacrifice. But it seems like it feels to me that it perhaps is a little bit too demanding for the public and for the general masses, where the sense of the common world, I think, is already shattered by our very division. And it is really hard to sort of mobilize them to really tell everyone to be able to make sacrifice for this kind of common purpose. And it also seems like this purely positive identity is really hard to maintain against the negative identity, which is created by today's nationalism, populism, where a common enemy is at play. And it seems like, after all, it's much easier to find someone we all hate and blame on rather than trust and believe. So I guess my question is that, do you think, for us as students and as politically conscious individuals, if we still were to believe in a common purpose, and if we were still to actually bring this onto reality, what should we do, and what as collectively as the Amherst College, which is a place for education, needs to do? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I've given you an awful lot of my mantras this evening, but I'll give you another one. Another one of my mantras is relations before transactions. And to some extent, as we seek for solutions, in our hard political landscape, we want the solution first. That's kind of really a transactional view. Like, we want to know, what's the answer? What's the policy that's going to bring us together? What's the one message that's going to bring us together? It's just a transaction. Like, we want the transaction of coming together to happen. So what does it mean to say relations before transactions? I told you the story of the commission and the work we did, sort of 40 of us, and the sort of way we kind of learned how to do something together. I'll tell you another story too. And as I tell this story, I kind of realize that the work I'm trying to do, which is about helping people who disagree find common purpose, is, I think, I'm realizing I'm suddenly having this moment of awareness that's like kind of countercultural. Which is very weird. It's very weird to say, like, I'm all about like compromise and bridging, and like that's countercultural. Right? Because it sort of seems like it should be the opposite way around, but I guess it is actually countercultural now that I stop and think about it. And so anyway, we were talking about civic education and the lack of investment in civic education. And this has been an issue, has been a cause of concern to me for a while. Worked with a group of others who share that concern, people who run civic education providers or do research on youth civic engagement, and we set up a team of 6 first, cross-partisan, with the goal of producing a national roadmap. How can we rebuild excellence in history and civic learning for all learners K through 12? And we're fortunate to secure funding from the NEH and the U.S. Department of Education to do this. And to do the work, we just kept building our group out. First we were 6, we were 12, 25, 300 ultimately working on this roadmap. Every single time we built our group, we made sure that we were including ideological diversity in our group. And it's not like it was smooth, and some of the stuff we fought over was stupid. Like in the very beginning, where there were just 6 of us, we spent 2 weeks arguing over whether or not our job was to educate people for a democracy or a republic. Kid you not. Well, we compromised. Constitutional democracy. I can explain that compromise if you want. Like, it's an actual, real, and meaningful, substantive compromise. Like, it took, like, we couldn't go any further until we figured that one out. And we figured that one out, and we could kind of keep moving. And we fought over other stuff. How to talk about race, how to talk about enslavement. Fought over all that stuff all the way through till the end. But we succeeded. We came to the end. We delivered something. And now, this is very countercultural what I'm about to say, which is that we have the rare distinction of being probably the only national project that was funded by both the Trump and the Biden administrations. Mm-hmm. I know, but it's true. And as we were finishing, the country's starting to go crazy with all the fights over CRT and everything. Like, the country's lost its mind. What's going on out there? And so, of course, our group's like, what are we going to do? Do we have to say something? What are we going to do? And we looked at each other and we said, what we are going to do is stay together. The 300 of us who did this work. Moving it forward, getting it into schools, getting communities to take it up, and we are going to ignore that crazy stuff and not betray each other. So I actually don't think there is an answer, like a kind of abstract answer, to how we get common purpose. I do think it's about relationships, and honestly, at this point in time, being willing to be countercultural.
All right, thank you.
You've spoken a lot about the need for civic engagement, which I agree. And this morning you mentioned a sort of a missing piece in that is engaging in state and local politics. And I think specifically you mentioned how in liberal states like Massachusetts, there's a huge lack of engagement in state and local politics. I witnessed this firsthand a few years ago when ranked choice voting actually came on the ballot here. I'm from Massachusetts, and I got really excited about that because I was excited about ranked choice voting, and I did some phone banking, and I noticed that there was a lot of support for it. Like, if you looked at street corners, at least where I was living, there was...
Where were you from?
I'm from Maynard, Mass.
Okay.
There were a lot of signs saying, like, vote yes on, I think it was question 2.
Yep, yes on 2.
And there was no opposition to it. I think I did some research, and there was, like, one article written by somebody saying, oh, it's too complicated. There was no opposition to it, and yet it was defeated. I think the consensus was people were, like, afraid of something new and afraid of, or just not willing to, like, learn about it and engage in the politics around them. And it seems like, maybe that extends to, like, just a lack of engagement in, like, community politics, on a political level and just on a communal level. And I guess I'm wondering how you, when the national politics are so exciting and, sort of polarized too, exciting and polarized, and the local politics are not talked about a lot, and are, I guess, not as exciting, but very important. And the communal aspect, very important. How you suggest to getting people to, re-engage in building community and re-engage in local politics.
Great questions. Thank you so much. And first of all, just thank you so much for getting involved and working on that ballot proposition. That's fantastic. And one of the challenges of participation, as that losses come along with wins, and you have to sort of learn how to take both of those in stride. And I think anytime we think about civic learning, one of the goals is to how to ensure that as people try things out and experiment with participation, you're ready to kind of go on to the next thing, even if the first thing is kind of frustrating. So thank you very much for engaging. So trying to get this another one, I'm going to struggle to give a short answer. Basically, there are a lot of people actually working really hard at grassroots levels in Massachusetts, and happy to share information. Like Voter Choice MA that ran that ballot proposition is still up and running, doing work. I'm building an organization called Partners in Democracy that is working on a lot of democracy reform questions in Massachusetts. Mass Voter Table is a great organization with a huge track record of real success. So you might check them out in particular, Mass Voter Table. And the reason I'm pointing you there is because they already have really well-developed kind of communities of people who are engaged around democracy. One of the challenges with the ranked choice voting ballot proposition was that the folks who ran it were themselves not yet that deeply experienced at grassroots organizing and work. And so in some sense, a lot of people who came into that ballot campaign still need to have the experience of getting connected to an organization that is already very alive at the grassroots level. And if you can bring that experience to bear, then you'll get lessons for how to engage the community right around you. So I'd really encourage you to check out Mass Voter Table. And Common Cause MA is another one. And then, participate in some of their things, and that will give you ideas for the specific things that would engage people in your community.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, so we'll go for Charlotte, and then.
Hi, Professor Allen. I have a question about democracy. So 70% of Americans believe that democracy is in peril, but very, very few people rate democracy as one of their top priorities among political issues. And I'm curious, number one, why you think that might be the case, and number two, how we might motivate more interest in meaningful democratic reform, meaningful democratic action, both nationally and in the context of like a college campus.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. I appreciate it. So it's a super important question, and I think connected to the previous question as well. It's important to remember what motivated the Constitutional Convention, right? Which you can think of as one of the sort of, historically speaking, great moments of democracy reform. And it wasn't democracy. Now, I don't mean by that democracy was absent from the picture, but what motivated the Constitutional Convention was a banking crisis. Congress couldn't pass a budget. Banks weren't operating. Congress couldn't get a quorum. The financial affairs of the country were about to go down the toilet. And they recognized that the solution to that problem was going to be governance change. Now, when they then undertook a governance redesign, they didn't just revert to monarchy. That's where democracy comes in, right? They knew they also had a positive commitment to freedom, to self-government, to that shared decision-making of free and equal citizens. But the motivation for the work was the banking crisis. So democracy reform, getting to a place where our democracy is truly healthy and giving us that chance to participate in an empowering political system, gives us responsive and resilient representation, we'll get it when the relevant reforms are clearly hooked up to solving the other hard problems we're trying to solve. housing, climate, the need for functional infrastructure, mastering the technology problem, and so forth. So that's where the challenge comes in. It's like, how can you actually pull together the substantive, like our biggest substantive challenges? I take our biggest substantive challenge to be that we're living through this massive scaling up of society, technologically enabled scaling up of society. Society's getting massively more complex. Urban areas are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Rural areas are getting more disconnected from those urban areas. That's all about scaling and about what technology delivers. It's like, how do we live in the midst of that in the ways that we can feel good about our life with each other, have mental well-being, feel safe? That's our problem. And we can't solve it without governance changes, because like our governance is broken, like not solving that problem. And then we want to make sure that the governance changes that we bring in to solve that problem improve democracy. I think that's how the story's going to go in the end.
Yes.
You mentioned this morning that you first noticed like the rift in our country, or more specifically our democracy, in your own generation. So I guess my question is, how much faith do you have in like my or our generation to fix this problem? And if you do have this faith, are we going to repair the democracy to what it was, or are we going to have to like learn to thrive despite the rift that has been created?
That is a very hard and beautiful question. I appreciate it. So I hope you won't have to thrive despite the rift. I believe our job is to, I won't say repair the rift, because like, what we're trying to do is move beyond the rift to something new. So I agree with the folks who say, this is not a vocabulary about restoring or recovering, or going back to. I often talk about the need to renovate our democracy. We need to renovate the house we live in together for new conditions. And while we renovate, we also have to be really honest, like the house was never built for everybody, and some people had like light-filled rooms with great views, and other people got stuck in dark and dungeon-like basements. So the renovation is really serious. It's partly about our changed demographic conditions, the scaling up I just described, but it's also about rectifying the fact that the house was never built for everybody. So renovation is the job that I believe that we have. And I do have faith in your generation. And I said earlier, I said this morning to folks, it's not like, the responsibility is not just on your shoulders, right? I mean, it's on our shoulders too. And so it's a cross-generational faith. But I do also know, sort of look at the history of periods of transformation, and young people have very often been the leaders of that, the carriers of that. You even look at the Constitutional Convention, and most of the folks who wrote the Constitution were in their 30s. Okay, which means if you use that kind of model, like it's you guys, it's not us. Okay? So I said this morning, I'm here to help. I'm here for you. I truly am. But we do need you, because you can see things that we can't see. And we need you to articulate that and help us find the path forward. And what we're asking from this other side of the generational line is, do hear us, please, when we try to articulate the value of self-government. It is worth something, the chance to steer your own life in your private life and to work with others to steer together in public. There is real human thriving and flourishing that comes from that. We know we haven't shown it to you, okay? We know. We're really sorry. Really, really sorry. But we are here to tell you we have experienced it. We can't experience it the way we experienced it before, because it was never good for everybody. But there is a real thing we are trying to communicate to you about a good thing that can be had for this country and all of us. And we need you, because of what you see where you are, to help us all find that path. That was a lot. So I appreciate your listening to me.
And we appreciate you being with us tonight.